friends, and welcome to this evening's discussion of research integrity. I'm Leif Winar, the Faculty Director of the McCoy Family Center for Ethics in Society here at Stanford. Our co-sponsor tonight is the Stanford Center for Biomedical Ethics, and all of us are just delighted that you're here for what promises to be a significant and timely conversation. As you know, the headlines are full of allegations of research misconduct. Allegations of falsified data, manipulated images have eroded society's trust in science and have shaken confidence in institutions of higher education. These allegations have also damaged the reputations of several high-profile scientists and even led to the resignations of academic leaders, including, of course, here at Stanford. All of our panelists tonight have thought deeply about research misconduct, what it is, how to detect it, how to deter it, how to hold those who do it accountable, and perhaps most profoundly, what are the professional dynamics that lead people to commit professional misconduct in the first place. If public trust in science and universities is going to be restored, changing the culture of research is a top priority, and we're eager for our discussion tonight to illuminate how we together might work towards that. So let me please introduce to you our distinguished members of the panel. Elisabeth Bik worked for 15 years as a microbiologist here at Stanford, and since 2019, she's been a science integrity consultant, specializing in detecting research misconduct in the biomedical literature, most famously here at Stanford, and most recently, you might have seen also at Harvard. Her work on research misconduct has resulted in over 1,000 retractions and 1,000 corrections, and for her excellence in science communication, Dr. Bik received the 2021 John Maddox Prize. Holden Thorp is a chemist, professor, and entrepreneur, currently on leave from George Washington University in order to oversee the Science family of journals, where he has been editor-in-chief since 2019. As well as being the editor of Science, Professor Thorp has held top leadership positions in the academy, serving as provost at Washington University, and before that as chancellor at his alma mater, the University of North Carolina. Professor Ruth O'Hara is a cognitive psychologist known for her research on biological markers of neurodegenerative diseases in later life. Most importantly for us, she is also the Senior Associate Dean for Research at the Stanford University School of Medicine, as well as holding the Lowell W. and Josephine Q. Berry Professorship of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences there. Professor Mildred Cho will be our moderator this evening, and we're very grateful to her for taking the place of David Magnus, who's under the weather. She's professor of pediatrics and associate director of research at the Center for Biomedical Ethics, as well as being professor of medicine in primary care and population health here at Stanford. Professor Cho works on the ethical and social issues raised by new technologies such as genetic testing, gene therapy, and artificial intelligence, as well as how biomedical researchers can be encouraged to integrate ethical issues into their work. Mentioning the Center for Biomedical Ethics is an excellent occasion to acknowledge the tremendous work of David Magnus and Holly Tabor, who have been fantastic partners in creating this event. We're sorry that illness will keep them from joining us tonight, and we wish them all the best. The format of our event is as follows. Each of the three panelists will speak for 10 minutes. Professor Cho will then engage our panelists in a moderated discussion for about 20 minutes, after which we'll open up for audience discussion at the mics in the aisles. Just one house rule, this event is being recorded and so will be available should you wish to share the conversation with others afterwards. So please don't record or photograph this event yourself. It's not allowed. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We are very much looking forward to the initial reflections of all of our experts, starting with Dr. Bik. Please join me in welcoming our panelists.
It's my great pleasure to be here today and talk about my work in science integrity. So my name is Elisabeth Bik. I worked actually 15 years at Stanford as a microbiologist. But a couple of years ago, I, by accident, discovered that somebody had plagiarized my paper. And that made me very angry. I'm still fueled by the anger that I felt on that day because somebody had stolen my work. And so I became very interested in science integrity. And a couple of years ago, I quit my job and am doing this now full time. So I'm sort of a science critic. I will look at scientific papers and criticize them. But since I quit my job, I will disclose how I make my money because apparently a lot of people are very curious about that. What do you do if you don't have a job? How can I, get funded for my work in science integrity? Because it's type of work that doesn't really get funded normally. So I'm funded by giving talks and doing science integrity consultancy work for institutions or publishers. But I mainly get most of my income through Patreon. And I do not say that to ask you to make a donation, but that is my main source of income. Because unfortunately, the work on criticizing science, once it's been published, is not really always received very well, and again, not fundable usually. So with that, I'm very grateful to have that funding. And I also have worked at a fraudulent company, Ubiome, and they were raided by the FBI. I'm not going to talk about that today, but just want to disclose that is on my resume. And I think all of us, this was not science integrity misconduct, it was more like health insurance misconduct. But definitely misconduct has touched my life as well. And so with that out of the way, I don't think I have to remind anybody that science integrity has been in the news lately. And there's many cases that you might have seen headlines for. I've been involved in a couple of these. And it has touched pretty much any university in the US and outside of the US. And these are huge scandals. And it's not just a rogue postdoc or a rogue graduate student. This has involved the careers of very highly placed persons. And so I think it's very timely to have this discussion today about what might drive people to do misconduct, or even talk about what is misconduct, because it can be many things. We can think of a lot of things that can go wrong in science, and most of these are not even misconduct. We could call them questionable research practices. And so science misconduct in the US is defined as one of three flavors or things. Plagiarism, stealing somebody's words or ideas, like what happened to me. Falsification, where a person obtains results, but change the results a little bit. Maybe change a value to a little bit higher, and so suddenly becomes a positive instead of a negative, and the results look so much better then. And falsification, finally, the third type of misconduct, is where a person completely makes up results. And think about how easy that would be. Like just typing some numbers in a spreadsheet and presenting them as real. How can we ever find out if that data was real? And so there's many things that can go wrong in scientific paper, and the distinction between those questionable research practices and science misconduct is actually not as straight as a line as you might think. There's many cases where it could be an honest error, or it could be have done deliberately, and it's just very hard to find out what happened. But what drives people to do misconduct? I think that's a very important question, and very often it's not just a rogue person who wants to do misconduct just for the sake of it. No, it's the whole field of academia that sort of drives people and rewards people when they obtain positive and nice results. So I have 3 scenarios here that you might think of that might lead people doing misconduct. On the left, you see what I call power play, where there's perhaps a grad student on a visa in the US working at a famous university. You might think of one. And they work for this really nice professor. They are very happy to have this position. But this professor turns out to be a bully, somebody who's very demanding and perhaps even never there in the lab. Perhaps they have several other jobs, and they are just very demanding of this person and even threatening to fire them. And I've been on a visa myself. I'm not originally a US citizen, so I've been in that situation. I can tell you, if you lose your job, you have to go back to your home country within 2 weeks. So that's a big threat if you are fired. And so in that situation, I believe some people might be tempted to do misconduct. Give the professor the results they want. Now they can get this nice paper, and they can leave that university with a nice PhD or a nice paper on their resume and go back home and perhaps become a professor in their own country. The second situation is where a person has been very successful, perhaps early in their career, then perhaps become a professor, maybe they even had a science or a nature paper, and now they switch jobs, they switch labs, and suddenly the results don't go very well. I think in that situation where a person has tasted success, they might be tempted to start cheating. The third scenario is where a person works in a country with very strict requirements on how many papers they should publish in order to become, for example, a medical doctor or get their PhD. And these requirements are so strict that they don't have time to do research, especially if you're an MD in medical school. You might not be interested in doing research. And so these people might see advertisements on social media by paper mills, as we call them, advertising for authorship. So all the MD has to do is pay some money and they become an author on a completely fake paper offered by paper mills. And I think these are 3 different scenarios that tell me that's often a sad situation in which a person might resort to misconduct. They don't really want to do it, but these are often the stories we hear. So the work that I do involves images. I have a background in biomedical science. And so these are the images that you might find in molecular biology papers. And here are 3 examples of duplications in papers that I might recognize by eye and nowadays by software. But when I began this work, I did all of this by eye. And the three types of duplications involve simple duplications where on the left, where there's 2 panels that are the same. Reposition duplications where samples, for example, have been shifted under the microscope. 2 photos are taken, but they overlap, and I might see that overlap. Might also involve perhaps rotation or mirroring. And then altered photos are photos that appear to have duplicated elements within a photo of Western blot bands or cells or parts of tissues. So that's the type of work I'm doing. I started my career in science integrity by investigating 20,000 papers, and I found roughly 800 papers to contain these duplications. And I reported them. We estimated about half of these duplications were not honest errors, but were deliberately done, especially when you have 2 images and one of them is rotated or stretched, or you have these images with duplicated elements. Those are very indicative for an intention to mislead. So after reporting these papers, I reported them to the journals, but unfortunately, in my experience, journals did not really reply well. Most of these papers, the majority of them, were not corrected or retracted after waiting 5 years. So that is frustrating. I'm reporting nowadays these papers on PubPeer. So AI, of course, is something we could perhaps also talk about in the discussion. If I can detect these by eye, I definitely cannot tell which of these 2 faces are AI-generated or real. One of them is real, and one of them is AI. This is from the New York Times, so you can take the test yourself. AI is becoming so good, we no longer can trust our eyes. So unfortunately, in science, the rewards are big, and the consequences are very few. And so I think this is one of the things we can also touch upon in the discussion. How can we make science better? Because it definitely seems to be very profitable to cheat in science because the chances of getting caught or having any repercussions are very small, with some exceptions. So for me, I do this work because science is about discovering the truth. I've talked a little bit about paper mills. I only have 10 minutes. But I do think we need to focus more on quality of papers than asking people to focus on metrics such as, how many papers did you publish, how many times are they cited. But it takes the role of everybody involved in science to do that. And unfortunately, it does come with an enormous cost, not just for science or for critics like myself, because I do get a lot of hate mail and threats of lawsuits, but for science as a whole, because any talk about science misconduct can lead people to lose their faith in science. And I hope that is not the case for the audience tonight. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Elisabeth. Let's hear it again for Elisabeth. It's really an honor to be on the program with Elisabeth. I talk about Elisabeth a lot because she writes to me, and then we have long meetings about what we're going to do when we hear from her. Not talking about her personally, but things she shares with me, which I don't always love getting. But, academics are people who should be able to hold two thoughts in their head at the same time. And that is, we may not like hearing from Elisabeth, but what she's doing is making science a lot better. And both of those things are true. It's an honor to be here with you and Dr. O'Hara as a former administrator. I know how hard your job is. Thank you for doing it. I'm going to say some things about administration today, and I just want to point out, I don't like administration, but I do like administrators. Administrators are mostly human beings trying to do the best they can, and what I'm going to try to persuade you of is a lot of the problems we have in science are systemic, and as long as we're treating them as problems of individual people, we're not going to get to the solution. So as Elisabeth already pointed out, this is an unbelievable moment for research integrity. But I want to point out that a lot of people, including John Ioannidis, who's here, and Elisabeth, and lots of people at journals, we've been working on this for a long time. It's only recently that this has been something that's in the news with the frequency that it's at. And it's not going to stop anytime soon. I don't know if you've noticed, but the Wall Street Journal now has a full-time reporter who is excellent, Nidhi Subbaraman, and I've spent a lot of time talking to her, this is her whole beat. So for all we know, she's writing up somebody in this room right now. One of those that Elisabeth had was one that came out since we had our planning call for this talk. So this moment is not going to end anytime soon. Eventually, people will probably move on to another topic, but for now, this is the thing that is with us. And like I said, a bunch of us have been working on this for a long time. I didn't really know that much about all this until I took this job in 2019. But just so that you understand where I'm coming from, that was a very nice introduction, but it left out one important thing, and that is that I left the University of North Carolina in a scandal. It was a scandal in intercollegiate athletics. It started when I was in middle school. It's been investigated up and down every way possible. Nobody ever found anything that I did that I should be culpable for. But I presided over the institution's response, which also is two things at the same time. The first is that it was sluggish and contributed to everything that went wrong. The second is we did pretty much what any university would have done in the same situation. But I learned then that it's better not to give evasive answers, because I think what happens in this is institutions give evasive answers, and that's what prolongs these things. And the longer they're prolonged, the more things that go wrong, and the more the journalists have to write about. I mean, the longer these things go on, you're just giving a gift to the journalists, because they can just write and write and write about all the little twists and turns. So the more evasive the institution's answers are, the longer the scandal's going to go. And that's certainly what happened to me. And so I've tried ever since I had the good fortune to get out alive to do the opposite of that, and which is what I'm trying to do on this matter. So we just announced that, as Elisabeth said, there are tools for seeing these image duplications. We're using ProofFig. There's another one called Image Twin. They both have their strengths and weaknesses. We preferred ProofFig when we tested it. We ran it for several months on a couple of our journals last year before we announced at the first of the year that we're doing it for everything. When we ran it on 300 papers, we found a lot of inadvertent errors, and that was great because the authors got a little report back that said, hey, you might not have noticed, but here's this thing in your figure, and if you publish it, Elisabeth or somebody else is going to see this problem. Why don't you change it? And it was, it was an inadvertent error or one that wasn't very significant. They corrected it. That saved all of us a lot of work in the future. But there were 2 out of the 300 that were clearly, that we were about to publish. And we're a little family that only had 6 journals. There were 2 out of 300 that we were getting ready to publish that we had to have withdrawn because of the analysis that we did. So that's 2 out of 300. We're a small family of journals with only 6 journals. That's only 3,000 papers. So 2 out of 300, that's close to 1%. We know we don't catch everything with the tools because now that the tools are here, you can just make your manipulations, run it through the tool, and see if the tool picks it up. So the tool is certainly not going to put Elisabeth's eyes out of business. And so let's say, we're catching half or something like that. That gets you pretty close to the same percentage that Elisabeth had for the number of fraudulent papers going through. And, we're a selective family of journals, so, a lot of these more open journals that take a lot of things are probably catching even less. So my analysis of that is that, of course, we should try to do more to change the culture, to catch things, to use our tools, to help address a lot of the systemic problems that Elisabeth was talking about, but we're never going to catch everything. So the only solution to this is to get better at responding when things happen. Because the chance that, some years we have 5 retractions in science, we have 700 papers. People say, aren't you worried about having 5 retractions? I said, no, the only number of retractions I would be worried about would be 0. Because I know the answer isn't 0. I know that there's no way, with all the human beings involved, that we're catching everything. And so if you read my editorials about this, you'll see that my general thing is that we need to just lower the stigma associated with correcting papers. We need to get the institutions to respond more proactively. We need the PIs to understand that correction, as I said in a piece, correction is courageous. Science is supposed to be a work in progress that's self-correcting. And so we're all capable of overseeing errors that are going to get into the literature if we correct them quickly, without litigation, without media firestorms, without finger pointing, then we have a better chance to get the public to trust that we can do this. And I say that as part of the problem. The journals have contributed to this problem. We're trying to do better, and I think we are. We're publishing more editorial expressions of concern. We're publishing retractions faster. We are doing things like giving deadlines to institutions and saying, if we don't hear from you by such and such a date, we're going to do something with this paper. And we're trying to stress the fact that we don't care. The journal doesn't care whether it's fraud or whether it's an honest error. Our job is to have a robust scientific record. So all the stuff about this postdoc did this, or I never saw this, or the PI's trying to deflect blame or whatever, we're not interested in all that. We're interested in whether we could correct the paper or not. And if we could get people to accept that correcting the paper is an okay thing to do, we could go ahead and do that. And if the institution wants to argue about who did what, then y'all knock yourself out. Because the people who come to the paper would now know that there's a problem there. And if instead, oh, there's an investigation and we can't tell you what's going on because we're protecting confidentiality and all of this stuff, then why would people trust that we can correct the paper in time? And so, to me, the actor that is contributing the most to the problem are the institutions. Again, the administration, not the administrators. The administrators are working under this lumbering bureaucracy that they can barely get out from under. But the institutions need to address a lot of the systemic problems that are causing this, the pressure on the PIs to bring in grants and do a million different things, and they need to do a much better job at giving postdocs and trainees and graduate students a holistic future. If all the pressure is to get an academic job, and you can't get an academic job without these same papers, then all you're doing is, A, first of all, you're depriving somebody the opportunity to decide what they would like to do with their life. And the second is that you're putting even more pressure on these errors. So I look forward to talking more about this, but my view is, we all have contributed to this problem, and as long as we're talking about who contributed and who didn't, we're not solving it. We got to solve the system. So thank you. It's an honor to be here. I look forward to talking to you further. You don't have any slides, so I guess I won't be missing anything.
You won't be missing anything. And anybody who starts their presentation with a quote from F. Scott Fitzgerald, as an Irish person, that's perfectly fine with me. Nicely done. I actually would disagree just slightly with Dr. Thorp in that I do believe institutions can do a lot. I think administrators can do a lot. And I think our moment is now. And indeed, in the domain of research integrity, as Holden mentioned, it has a long past, albeit perhaps a shorter history. So it's a great pleasure today to be part of this conversation. Like so many wonderful things that happen, they bring challenges, they bring change. Over the past decades, we have seen significant growth, exciting growth in biomedical research, locally, here at Stanford, nationally, and globally. And of course, as such research increases, it's becoming more interdisciplinary. It's routine for those of us in the School of Medicine to partner with our colleagues in the School of Education, the School of Sustainability. It becomes more multidimensional, more collaborative, but as a result, it becomes more complex. And there are appropriately significant increases in the regulations, the oversight, the policies and guiding principles that investigators are called upon to pay attention to. But of course, that is no small task. Even the best scientists and very best labs experience issues. And in fact, building on the numbers presented by Dr. Bik, it's notable that one of the very first publications that sort of drew attention, which was mostly self-report surveys to the issues of plagiarism, misconduct in research, the numbers are very similar. They identified about 2% of really serious issues where, in fact, the investigators self-declared they plagiarized, self-declared, these were anonymous, needless to say, that they had actually committed some egregious research misconduct. But the number of individuals who said that they actually engaged in more questionable, sort of dubious activities that perhaps weren't in the full spirit of research integrity was closer to 75%. And I look to my good colleague, Dr. Goodman here in the audience, who has a wonderful term called disconduct, where in fact there's a spectrum of activities where we have to be careful of how we're proceeding, the procedures we're putting in place, and the kinds of approaches that we're taking to rigor and reproducibility in our local, national, and global environments. Many weeks ago, we were visited by Dr. Swami, the Vice Dean of Scientific Integrity at Duke, who stated what we really need to do now is build a culture that emphasizes rigor and reproducibility. And this is where I think institutions can do a lot. Dr. Goodman started our own program here at Stanford School of Medicine in research rigor and reproducibility. And it's garnered so much attention and so many individuals coming and availing of the trainings and the various resources that are provided. And he did that long before it was really fashionable to do so. Rigor and reproducibility is so much more than just accountability. And I think this is the distinction that Dr. Thorp has been trying to make here for us, that, you know, administrators, you get a checklist, you kind of, okay, that box is checked, we're all doing our conflicts of interest, we're all making sure that, in fact, we've attended these trainings. But it's much more. What it is really about is doing the best science possible. If your science is not actually able to be replicated by others, then you have an issue. And in fact, it was very curious to me, Elisabeth, you mentioned about the various sources of scientific misconduct. And you talked about somebody moving from one lab to another and finding that they weren't doing very well with their experiments. It's an interesting way to characterize that your hypothesis is not being substantiated. I think one of the greatest challenges that we have, and a systemic problem that we can address, is that at a very early stage of career, nothing but the positive finding will do. Well, it belies the statistical understanding that, in fact, if we're relating multitudes of variables to each other, that we won't on occasion have, in fact, a null hypothesis proven, although that takes a significant amount of statistical power. But I do think that one of the problems we've had in attaining better levels of rigor and reproducibility is a sense that a finding or experiment that does not produce the hypothesis outcome is, in fact, a failure. And it's still very hard for those of us who have tried to actually get those negative findings, which are substantial contributors to the scientific record, actually published. So Elisabeth had a paper in 2016 as a wonderful conclusion that says, we are all involved in actually attaining the vision of rigor and reproducible research, involving everyone, including the funders and the sponsors, the institutions themselves, and I would add to that the publishers. And certainly Dr. Thorp has led the way in this regard. His recent piece in 2023 on how important it is to be open about the mistakes we made and make and will make is essential for actually being able to produce a rigorous and reproducible set of scientific innovations. It's really key. As an institution, there are other things we can do. I think one of the first things we can do is pay attention to training. Dr. McRae was another professor who visited us here from Harvard. She chairs their committee on scientific rigor, shows that all institutions across the country are really starting to think about this, and said that the fundamental way they're starting to address this is providing several mentors to their junior investigators, postdocs, faculty, in order to provide them with the best possible practices with respect to actually implementing strong, rigorous, and reproducible research. But it's much more than courses. Here, too, at Stanford, we have many courses and mentorship. It's also a way of recognizing attainment that institutions are going to have to change their approach. So, for example, a standard metric of having to have the big splash paper or you're not going to get a job, something I hear from our postdocs all the time. We have to create a culture that makes it clear that, first of all, is not the case, and second of all, that in fact embracing and pursuing upon experiments that have not yielded positive findings can in fact be the way to the truth that is actually the essence of the scientific problem they're investigating. We have to look at how we're measuring promotional activities. And of course, the other component is this does not stop for junior investigators. It's very easy to say, you know, we have to do the training, do it early. I agree with that, right down to the undergraduate level. We can be doing so much more to teach our undergraduates about how to do good research right from the get-go, because often they're doing studies. But what about the mid-career and senior level faculty? They too need to be able to have a system that is supportive of them, that is helpful in training them to change culture. That might mean some aspects of stepping down from roles that they've been accustomed to having, running labs with multiple postdocs, but not having necessarily the bandwidth, either time-wise or otherwise, to be able to actually engage on a sufficient level day to day. That's a thorny problem and one we have to address. In addition, in an era of team science and increased collaboration, it seems like we have a wonderful opportunity here to build models of team science that engage other faculty members with a lab to be able to actually have a wide range of individuals be responsible for making sure the mentorship and attention to detail in any given lab is not left at the foot of one single individual, which in this day and age is just simply too much by the virtue of the nature of the research itself and the emphasis on increasingly engaging multiple teams, interdisciplinary groups, and broad ranges of trainees. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for what we can do in this domain. I am, of course, a perpetual optimist, so that's my leaning, but I think institutions need to come together to do exactly this. Thank you very much for your time.
Okay, thank you very much. I have so many questions. I know the audience does too, and so you'll have plenty of time, I promise, to ask your questions at the mic. But let me just start by starting off with a sort of framing question to get us into this issue of how we can create a culture of scientific integrity. That's kind of the core of the issue that we're going to be talking about today. But I want to just sort of back us up one step and ask you all to speak to what you think integrity means, scientific integrity means, because I think there's sort of an underlying premise to this session that integrity is the opposite of misconduct. And coming from a background in bioethics, I think about how my medical ethics colleagues would think about that question. And they would never say that medical ethics and what a clinician should do is just don't do misconduct, don't do malpractice, right? So, and you mentioned this, Ruth, they talk about acting in the best interests of a patient, right? So I wonder if you could each speak, maybe you could start, Elisabeth, to what you think, you know, what should the goals be in creating a culture of integrity? What does integrity mean?
So what personally drives me is that science should be about finding the truth. That is for me the heart of science. So, and it's much more than lying or falsification. As I showed on my slide, there's a lot of things that can go wrong with doing science, and it could just be, you know, not rigorous labeling of your tubes or of your files, and so you will down the road you will create errors in selecting your images or running your program. There needs to be also an amount of rigor of doing things properly with the right methods, slowly enough so that you don't make those errors. So there shouldn't be any rush or pressure to publish positive results or to publish an X amount of papers. And as you also said, like there should be ethical considerations, like if, for example, if you have patients donating donating samples to your lab for your research, but the results are negative and you don't publish that, I feel there's an ethical question that now remains, because these people have donated their samples, or maybe your animals that you've used in your studies have donated their lives. Like, I feel there's an ethical consideration of publishing these results, and that is not misconduct, but those are questionable research practices if you don't publish it. So just some initial thoughts.
Yeah, and I'm very focused on the human side of all of it. I think that if we achieved scientific integrity, we would also have a generative, I love the word generative, now ChatGPT stole the damn thing. We would have I don't even know another word for it, what we used to call generative culture, where information could come from anybody, be valued. We wouldn't have the punitive things that we have in science. We wouldn't have the pressures that we have. We would have a group of people working collaboratively to, as Elisabeth says, find the truth. And if we achieve that, then a lot of the problems that higher education has, like graduate students logically being on strike to get more money, the money that they deserve, like people, feeling like they deserve more in terms of helping get themselves into the career that they want, that young faculty being able to publish and get the work that they want to get done. All of these things would come from a sort of wholesale revision of what it is that we all think that we're here for. And that is a lofty goal. We would have to get rid of all kinds of greed and ambition and ego and things that are perfectly human traits. But to me, striving for that is what striving for scientific integrity is, because when you see a falsified paper, that's just a readout of the lack of humanity in academic science.
Thanks. Ruth?
I totally agree with both Elisabeth and Holden. I mean, I do like the notion that there is a spectrum that we're trying to attain, where you actually can go from, what's obviously just flagrant plagiarism, for example, or changing of data. But there are very simple decisions that we all make every day in our labs, like, is that truly an outlier? Whether it's a basic study or an animal study or a human study, is this something that should have been removed? What's the rationale? Does it alter the results? There are so many points in the conduct of research where we're called upon to really think about what we're doing ethically. For clinical trials, are we inadvertently changing the exclusion or inclusion criteria because we're not actually recruiting as many participants as we had hoped for the trial? So I think it's really a way of doing better research, more rigorous research at every step, and recognizing that, when we have sources of bias, whether they're personal bias, that, it's going to help me get the job if I tweak that data, or whether it's just bias towards where you think the results should be, we have to contain that bias. And I think that bias and the multiple sources of bias are really integrally linked to actually integrity and being able to do the best research possible.
Well, let me jump off of that then for a second, because when you were talking about clinical trials, it struck me that the clinical trials process has evolved a lot of, as you say, bias controls, but it's also as part of the process. So we have things like data safety monitoring boards, right? We have methodological tools such as randomization and double blinding and that sort of thing that are built in to research design. So it's sort of design issues and process issues. Do you think that clinical research can be a model for by including other stakeholders in the process, such as data safety monitoring boards or other people in the scientific teams that are working?
I think it's a very good model, and I think external bodies that actually provide that kind of oversight and that are not linked to the papers and the outcomes, that build in an inherent bias right away, is tremendous to do. It is difficult to, however, say that there aren't other potential sources of bias. Like just in the pure assessment of an inclusion or exclusion criteria that on paper may end up looking like the patient was really appropriate. So the DSMB might not necessarily see that. I think it's hard to say any one domain of research has the higher moral ground, as it were, than another, but I do think they can inform each other. I mean, within animal research, there's a tremendous effort to make sure that, in fact, minimal numbers of animals are used, the minimum possible, to actually attain a sufficient power to see an effect. And so that requires a lot of really well-crafted statistics and approaches that I often wonder should be taking the same approach in the clinical trial. I think it's really more a recognition that we need that these are important factors that go into actually having research that will then be reproducible and has been done in a way that allows you as an investigator to have a good night's sleep.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to come back to something you said, Holden, and it relates to also something that Elisabeth said. And Elisabeth, you mentioned, you sort of characterized what you're doing as scientific critique. But it struck me that a lot of other people would call that whistleblowing. And it seems to me that that is at the heart of this culture problem, that we need to shift the mindset. Because I thought, well, isn't what you're doing, Elisabeth, isn't that part of science? Shouldn't that be part of the you're doing peer review, right? You're, and so I'm just wondering what you think about that in terms of how those mindset changes might or might not be folded into the peer review process.
Are you asking me?
Yeah.
Yeah, so first of all, I think it's important to establish what we ask the reviewers to do and what we don't ask them to do. We ask them to tell us whether they think that the findings of the paper are ones that justify publication in whatever journal it is. And we ask them mostly to take on good faith the experiments and tell us whether the experiments that were done justify the conclusions in the paper. We don't ask them, and it would be completely impractical to do this, to go through every figure, every line of data. You know, now we're putting terabytes of data on Zenodo with some papers. We don't ask the reviewers to go through all that. So I think it's important, because people like to say, well, peer review is the whole problem of this, to clarify what it is that we ask the reviewers to do. The journal is taking responsibility for using that and deciding whether to publish a paper, and part of our responsibility is to maintain that paper, and that is to publish corrections and retractions, to facilitate the conversation between people who might critique the paper and the authors. You know, we're responsible for that. And the reviewers are doing a service for us, for which we're quite grateful. We can get some more questions about all that probably. Mm-hmm. But we don't ask the reviewers to look for fraud. I believe we catch more fraud in our journals that have professional editors than we do with academic editors. There are other positives to having academic editors, but the journals that we have that have professional editors who read papers all day, they're more likely to spot an error than a reviewer would be, who's doing a bunch of things, and sometimes even than the authors would be. So I think that's important to remember about what the reviewers do, and what the journals have responsibility for, what the institutions have responsibility for, and what the authors have responsibility for. We each have a stake in this. And sometimes I think as everybody's analyzing this, they may attribute the problems to the wrong stakeholder.
Okay, so that's kind of coming from a point of view of the status quo, right?
Right.
So let me shake it up a little bit.
Sure.
Let me ask you, Elisabeth, whether you think, what if we cloned you and made 1,000 of you, or throw open the peer review process, as some fields do, to open source it? Let's crowdsource this. Let's make it true peer review, open it up. What do you think? Do you think that would work?
Yeah, I mean, that's what I often say in my talks, like as a possible solution would be, we could publish smaller amounts of data. I think papers are currently getting so big that 1 or 2 or 3 peer reviewers and an editor could not possibly give, the years of work being put into a paper and the gigabytes of data to go over all of that and do it justice. So I would be open towards a much smaller type of data being published online in a sort of open way where people can openly comment on it. And whether that is in the setting of a journal or some, similar to bioRxiv, somebody setting up something online that you can just comment on. I think that might be a way of inviting more people's eyes to it and more criticism and make the paper sort of a growing thing where it sort of goes through different stages of critique and gets adapted. But whether or not that is something that could actually work, I don't know. A lot of bioRxiv or medRxiv papers don't get any comments at all. But I've seen very little fraud, for example, in those papers. I think people who put things in the open do so because they have honest data and they do it with the best of intentions of making it better and soliciting comments from the audience.
Yeah, and I would just add to that I think we prefer people to post a preprint when they send us their paper. And the reason is it's free reviewing for us. we of course, if somebody posts a preprint, we go to the comments on that preprint before we decide whether to accept the paper or not. And as Elisabeth's saying, if you don't post a preprint and the only people who see it are the authors, the editor, and the reviewers, then you've only put 8 eyes or something like pairs of eyes on the paper instead of potentially thousands, which would turn up a problem. As far as open reviews are concerned, we still have confidential reviews. We're watching a lot of the places that are posting reviews, and if I had to guess, I'd say over some period of years, reviews will continue to become more and more open. The one problem that we have that we haven't seen a solution to yet, which is why we wait, is that we get a lot of young faculty members telling us they don't want open peer review because they don't want people with a lot of influence to see if they wrote a negative review on their paper. And that gets to the culture of academia and the hierarchy and all these other problems that we've been talking about. But we're very pro preprint. Now you may ask, okay, so why do you even need to be there? And that also has a cultural answer, which is for the time being, the institutions have outsourced quality assessment to the journals. That's a very transparent way of saying what the problem is. But having been a provost, I can tell you that I spent every spring with a stack of CVs on my desk this big, and if my job was to read them all and decide their academic merit, I would have absolutely no way of doing that. So for the time being, the institutions and the granting agencies have decided that the journals are the ones who decide, we're the sorting hat that decides where these papers go. And so that's, for us, there's really no risk in them being in preprints because it doesn't change whether people need us to evaluate these papers or not.
Mm-hmm. So Ruth, what do you say as a dean? What do you tell your faculty about that?
Well, I tell them, for example, that they should know that NIH regularly utilizes Authenticate, so that these are becoming common practices, and it's a way of reminding them that oversight they're going to encounter it at every level. And it's a reminder not to, quote, please don't cheat. It really is just to make people aware that probably in the history of biomedical research, we've never had more oversight from federal agencies about our foreign engagements, about whether or not our grants are not actually giving us papers that were utilized but not referenced in the grant. I mean, there's a very high level of oversight. I think it's a very good thing in ways, because I think rather than the whistleblower, it is a reminder of the importance in getting it right, because ultimately that medication, that drug, that finding is not going to make its way to treat people, to be replicated in other research, and actually contribute to the broader scientific field if we're not doing it right.
And you mentioned a lot of things that that would give incentives for people to replicate their results, or maybe we could reward people for participating in peer review. There's really no reward, there's no recognition for that. Are these things that you could see, you could envision sort of embedding in the academic reward environment?
Oh, totally. And I think that's actually a very important step. You know, for example, our program on rigor and reproducibility needed the buy-in of our leadership in order to actually to be a program in the School of Medicine. We got the buy-in because it was recognized it was so important. Information comes back from our sort of engagement with our faculty and our postdocs, our trainees, our junior faculty in particular, about how their CVs should be presented during promotional review. And actually, I think we do a pretty good job locally of recognizing that, in fact, there is room on those CVs for talking about how often a paper is reproduced as a marker and a metric. I think institutions are quite open to that. It'll take some change, but I think there are numbers of ways that we can, right now, if you serve on study section for NIH, that's a very sort of laudatory thing to have as a measure of your expertise on a CV that's going up to be reviewed for promotion. I think we could absolutely, in fact we do, we ask which journals are you contributing to, but I think there's much more we can do in that domain to incentivize, in fact, best scientific conduct.
Okay, I think we're going to open it up to the audience. I'll ask one more question while you all are thinking about your questions, and you can feel free to line up at the microphones in the aisle. But Elisabeth, you mentioned artificial intelligence, and you did talk about ChatGPT. Can you just tell us what your worst fears are there?
Well, I think these AI tools, and in particular text-generating AI tools, can be used for many good things. For me, as a non-native English speaker, I realize the importance of having a little computer help sometimes for me in rephrasing things that I feel are not well phrased. And you know, speaking to other people for whom English is also not their first language, they love to be able to use these tools where they can, for example, write a summary or write a text and have ChatGPT reword it. But it doesn't really work well to write a scientific paper. It creates fake references. It doesn't go as deep as most scientific papers go. But I do see some future where these types of tools could help us write better papers and perhaps provide a better literature overview. I don't think it's ready yet at that stage. But what I'm very afraid of is generative AI that can make photos and videos and data sets that are absolutely really realistic looking, and we no longer as a human can trust our eyes or our gut feeling if these data sets or these photos are real or not. And we tend to say a photo or it didn't happen, but with a scientific paper where photos are part of the data, we can no longer trust that these photos are really proof that there was really a mouse and a tumor or a Western blot or a gel being made or done. And I think this is a very scary reality that we are all not ready for.
Okay, well, I see we have a lot of questions here, so why don't we start over here and then we'll alternate.
So I realize that in just an hour-long conversation, you can barely touch on many of the topics that need to be discussed. But let me bring up at least one, and I may sneak in another gap that I think is actually an enormous gap in the conversation tonight, and in fact, in discussion of fraud in science that's before the public. All of the discussion that I am aware of, including tonight's, has to do with fraud committed by scientists as authors who doctor their data or results, and none of the discussion is concerned with scientists as reviewers who operate in the secrecy afforded to them, their anonymity typically afforded to them, and there's a code of omerta surrounding the review process, and these scientists can, and sometimes do, write reviews that are, have no substantive content relating to the work under consideration, but rather are simply full of fulminations and, in one case that I'm aware of, outright and easily detectable lies. In the few moments before this session, Elisabeth shared with me that she has experience of this sort of scientific fraud. I also have had experience with that, and it's being covered up entirely because everyone is tight-lipped. And I'll sneak in that second one.
Well, let me just
yes.
say that do you have a question? I'd like everybody to have brief questions.
Why is
to
no
ask.
one talking about the code of silence? How do you propose that we can make the review process honest? If some scientists have the motivation to fake results or data when they know they could possibly be detected by people by super sleuths like Elisabeth, how many more do you think are acting as reviewers going to commit fraud, that kind of fraud, when they know there's essentially zero prospect of their being detected?
Okay, so you want to start?
Yeah, I can say something. I mean, technically, and I'm sure you'll disagree, that would not qualify as fraud because reviewers are being asked by editors to review, so they cannot just come in and, have a thumbs down on a paper if they wanted to. They're being asked by editors, and a good editor would, and I'm sure that Holden will agree with me, a good editor would look at a review and qualify it as, is this really making sense, this critique, or not? And so I've been an editor very briefly, not a very good one, I'm afraid, but you see these reviews where they're just completely either useless because there's no information in it, or their arguments do not hold up. So as an editor, you can definitely say these peer reviews do not count, and you can have a back and forth. So I don't agree that this is like an like that there's a secret, I don't know, community of peer reviewers who are doing this as a fraud. So I do think this happens. It happens behind the scenes. Usually there's discussion behind the scenes. It's not always done in the open, but I'm not agreeing with you that it is fraud.
Okay, let's move on to the next.
What are your thoughts about the role of industry and its contribution to bias in science, as well as research and research integrity and how we come at it? I'm thinking about climate science. I'm thinking about pharma. I'm thinking about tobacco industry, and now psilocybin, psychedelic industries that want to sell this. Just where does that come into this? Your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so we spend a lot of time on this more and more as time goes on because particularly in social science, the companies, some of whom are headquartered here, have treasure troves of social science data that are never going to be replicated, and same thing with genetics, with 23andMe and Ancestry, that are never going to be replicated in a public resource. There's no way to imagine that could happen. And so we get papers. We published a big package from Facebook last year. Not everybody thought we should publish it because it's very hard to say that Facebook gave us every last piece of data that we should have analyzed. But we we had all kinds of independent assessments that said that, you know, there was enough there that we should let the world see about this. And we put it out there, and so far we haven't really gotten any objections to the data in the paper. But this is a really important issue, and it also, the other thing that happens a lot, and this is a good town to make this point in, is that industry doesn't always want to give us all the underlying data. And we're always debating whether we have enough. And I would say over time, what we're seeing is that more and more data are being deposited. And so if that continues, then it's going to make it harder and harder for things that aren't objective to get into the literature. So certainly something that I think has happened over the last 20 years that's a huge improvement for all of this is the amount of underlying data that get published with papers. And we facilitate that by, if you submit a paper to us and you need assistance depositing it, then we have a program where we'll pay for Dryad to post your data.
Okay,
To try to
let's go over. Oh, thank you. Let's go over here.
So Dr. O'Hara, thank you for commenting on team science. So your comments and those of Manisha Desai at the colloquium organized by SPORE actually serve as an inspiration for conversations I've had with grad students, where we essentially acknowledge to one another that we have, in some situations, passed on opportunities to participate in team science because we were concerned that the reward was going to be inadequate to our effort. And so I have two questions for you. First, what can we do systemically here at Stanford to promote team science, and what advice do you have for early career researchers who want to do better?
Yeah, we are fortunate in the School of Medicine, and I'm sure at other schools, but it's the only one I can speak to. We have a very forward-thinking Office of Academic Affairs that really follows what's happening with respect to the emphasis on team science and how collaborative interdisciplinary contributions need to be recognized for promotion and promotional criteria. So I think we need to do more, but I think already there is an understanding of how critical that is. I think that's going to become even more essential as the scale of any given project now becomes so large. We've so many large grant processes that bring together investigators, and we need to find ways of making sure the junior investigator gets recognition. I think we're pretty good about doing that, but I don't think we're always good about communicating down to our junior investigators that, in fact, if they note this in their CV, if they provide this in their statement when they actually come up for review, that actually it will count. And we have to do more in getting the word out, and Manisha is indeed, Dr. Desai, one of the leaders in that regard. But I think you're only going to see more of that acknowledgement of team science. And I think where it'll become critical is when people come to a mid-career or even more senior career, to make sure those individuals can step in to be the leaders within a lab, to actually monitor and mentor students and also postdocs so that the work is distributed in a way that's manageable.
Thanks, Ruth. Over here.
So I have a twofold question. One, all of you highlighted the importance of publishing negative results, and then Dr. O'Hara also highlighted the importance of publishing reproducible results. But then we often see that it's very hard to publish negative results in any journal, if at all, a reputable journal. And second, if you're the second one to come up with the same results, you're never going to publish it in a very good journal unless, you code it with everything that's required for the journal. So what are your thoughts on both of those?
Superb points. To the latter point about actually being, reproducing data that somebody else did, the hope is actually that something that you did that was, say, innovative or novel that gets out there is also reproduced by others in other domains. One of the things that is important is it's very rarely an absolute, true, reproducible analysis or publication. There will always be a variation on a theme, but it's still an ability for you to actually cite that work when you come to actually advertise what you're doing in your lab as a place where your work has actually been replicated to some degree. So it wasn't really about you replicating the work. it is very challenging. Innovation is a key component of what NIH grants look for, what's new. And oftentimes when we're exploring something that's new, we don't actually hit the mark of that being the finding that we end up with. So, but I do think there is probably more recognition of that. And if you adapt and show that you actually have learned something from that finding, the lack of the finding, that can often be the place where we have some of the most significant contributions to all sorts of domains. But I do think it would be wonderful if publishers could actually take on some of these negative findings, because that's often, if it's sufficiently powered, a vital piece of information.
Yeah, we're subtly trying to change that. It is, you've outlined a very, very challenging problem because all of the emphasis is on novelty and being first and all of that stuff. And, you know, the best way to get a paper into Science is to prove something that we thought for 50 years turns out needs to be changed. We don't take a lot of papers that say, we tested this hypothesis and we found that it's still correct. We don't take that very often, but we're trying to give more people in different subdisciplines the opportunity to publish with us, and not just the person who gets there first. And also, I think another element of this that's really important is we may have put too much emphasis on publishing papers that give you the whole story all the way from the molecule to the person, right? And we put people through so much, you know, adding all of that stuff. You know, there's nothing wrong with observing something that's just amazing. And, you know, wait, if it takes 20 years to work out the mechanism, so what? You know, still cool. So we're subtly trying to do that, but it's a fair criticism, absolutely.
Okay, over here.
Hi, my name is Stephanie. I'm with the Chronicle of Higher Education, and my question's for Holden.
Hi.
Hi. So given the setting of tonight's event, I just have to ask. So Science retracted 2 papers by Dr. Tessier-Levine recently, and concerns about those papers had been raised a few years before those retractions happened. So I was wondering, I'd love to hear you share what, if anything, you think the journal could have done differently recently or over time, and then also what lessons do you think that episode has for journals in terms of addressing scientific misconduct concerns?
Yeah, so those are old papers, so all of that happened before I came, but I was very involved in the whole story because, you know, we had 2 of Mark's papers that ended up being retracted, and so I spent quite a lot of time talking to him, maybe more than any reporter, or maybe more than just about anybody else except, you know, people in his family and stuff. Certainly more than any reporter, because to my knowledge, he wasn't talking on the record or even off to any journalist, not you, I would imagine. So I think what happened, so the journal's role, you know, we missed the fact that those papers were wrong at the time. It was things were new. It was due to a lot of the reasons that we've been talking about here. We had a hiccup when he tried to correct the papers where the corrections weren't posted. I answered questions about that on the record many times. We cannot find what happened. I get that if you're a journalist, you think we were somehow trying to do him a favor, but I can tell you that it was in part of the organization where nobody knew the difference between Mark Tessier-Levine and anybody else. So we didn't find anybody at the upper, you know, even with searching all the emails. But as far as the matter itself is concerned and what I think went wrong, I mean, having presided over a university matter similar to this myself, you know, fortunately didn't involve me directly, but it was the same dynamics. I think the institution was incredibly sluggish in responding. I think that the fact that Mark Tessier-Levine or any board member never went on the record with any reporters. If you send a reporter a canned statement, I mean, I've been on both sides of these things because I have a news division at Science now with 30 journalists who write about all this stuff. If you send a journalist a canned statement, then that's just a way of telling them that you're hiding something. And so the only way you can get around that is for the people in question to tough questions from a reporter. And, you know, if Mark didn't want to talk to Theo Baker, he could have talked to you. He could have talked to somebody who works for me. He could have talked to, you know, Amy Goldstein, who covered this at the Wall Street Journal, who's a Pulitzer Prize winner. These are fair reporters that they could have talked to. And one thing you know, and I learned this myself also the hard way, once the university stands up an investigation and pays tens of millions of dollars to do an investigation, you're going to have a bad outcome at the end, because no one is going to be happy with that investigation. And so the only prayer you have, I mean, the best thing that could have happened in North Carolina, you can Google all this if you want to read my life story, it would have been as soon as we found out there was a problem, if I'd walked out on the steps of South Building, which is our administration building, and said, hey, everybody, we cheated at sports for 30 years. Damn, I'm sorry. I'm going to do everything I can to straighten this out. And, you know, I'm going to go back in and do my job and try to straighten this out. And if you need me to leave, you know, because I'm the one who told you this, then okay, that's okay too. I had to leave anyway, so I wouldn't have given anything up by this. But these research integrity scandals all have this very same element, where the institution is trying to apply its bureaucracy to a problem that requires them to be forthcoming and transparent. And I've devoted my life now to this particular topic.
Thank you.
Good to see you.
Over here.
John?
Thank you very much for the very insightful presentations and discussion. It's really refreshing to see three luminaries of science who have thought so much about these important issues.
You started all this, John.
Yeah.
Oh, no. So the very little that I started for many decades, whenever I was asked, is fraud common in science, I always used to say, no, fraud is not a big issue. It's 1%, 2%, you know, everybody kind of gave similar quotes yesterday. What is very common is error, questionable research practices, detrimental research practices. Now, increasingly over the last several years, I feel that I've been very wrong about this. And we have examples like John Carlisle looking at clinical trials and finding that when looking at the raw data, about 40% are zombie trials, which are, you know, fraudulent or completely messed up. These are like the most difficult designs to have a fraudulent product. We have, you know, big scandals at our top institutions. We have Nobel laureates having massive retractions of papers that, you know, perhaps it was not them, but, you know, their team just produced lots of work that was completely unreliable. And I have upgraded my estimates substantially. What is worse, I feel that the problem now is not just about grassroots, the average young scientist, but it has affected science leadership. So my feeling is that across the top of the top science leadership, we have a lot of corruption, a lot of people who are frauds, and a lot of people who maybe are not frauds, but they don't know about the problems, they do not recognize the problems, or are misinformed about the problems. And if that's the case, we need a completely different approach, because it's not just informing the young generation and those who are in the making of becoming scientists, but we have to do something about who is running the show. Do you share that view, or am I schizophrenic, which may well be?
Do you want me to?
Go ahead.
I'll start. You know, it's so interesting because one of the points I wanted to make, actually, John, was that, you know, we talk about the training for junior faculty, but, you know, regulations change, approaches change, emphasis change, and it's very easy for someone at my stage of career to forget, you know, if I wasn't actually the one responsible for implementing those particular policies and guidelines, to forget the changes. So I do think we have a responsibility across the lifespan of an academic's career to really be thinking about ways that we're able to support actually a lack of deviance from the normative efforts towards a good, rigorous, and reproducible set of science from that individual. I do caution that at this point in time in our history, we see a lot of headlines, including within academic papers. And I'm a little wary of conjecturing that actually there was so much more fraud than we ever thought, more flagrant plagiarism than we ever thought. It's very hard to dissociate time and the new technologies and the broadening of research and the complexity of research from what we dealt with when you and I started our careers. I think I'm careful about conjecturing that, but I'm not naive, I think, about the need to recognize that we need support systems and changes in this regard at all stages of the academic's lifespan, at least as an academic.
Yeah, I think the underlying problem, though, is quite simple, and that is that we're just trying to do too much science. And we're trying to stretch the resources we have to do it too far. So that ups the pressure to be productive, that pushes down the salaries of the graduate students and postdocs, that, all of these things, every single one of these problems is because we're emphasizing quantity over quality. And, it's going to take some kind of unilateral disarmament to stop that. And maybe this moment that we're living through is a reason to do that. But as long as we have labs with 100 people in them where the PI's got a company and also a vice dean of something in their own center, and they're traveling around all the world all the time, and that's the norm, rather than having a group of 10 people where you're in the lab all the time and you're actually interacting with your group, and this is all being done in a ongoing way. Because I'll tell you one thing we know doesn't work, and that is all those videos that we have to watch. Okay, and just to tell you something funny, I mean, at the AAAS, we publish papers about how those videos don't work, but we all have to watch the videos anyway. And so, I'm certain that the answer to this is not making people watch a lot of LinkedIn videos that they don't pay attention to. Because the one thing I learned when I was an administrator is people don't only absorb information when they need it. And so if you give it to them proactively, it's like college students reading the syllabus. There's a running gag among college professors that every undergraduate asks you a question, the answer is it's on the syllabus. Why don't they read it? Well, because they didn't need it when you handed them the syllabus. They need that information now. Yeah. And that's just human nature. So the only way this gets fixed is if we have a much more collaborative and generative, again, it's not ChatGPT, culture to producing the truth.
Yeah. Okay, I see it's 6:30, but I also realize that we started a little late. I don't know, do we have a few minutes? Okay, because people have been standing for a long time.
They've been standing.
So let's go quickly.
Yes, quickly. My name is Reza. I'm an undergraduate student researcher. And Holden, I heard your talk on how science has lost America. I wanted to ask about research misconduct and public perceptions of science and how all of these things are working together to sort of question, is science, can I trust it? Is it truthful? What is this entire scene in your view and also the rest of you?
Oh, I think this is making a huge contribution to the lack of trust in science.
What do we do about it?
What do we do about it? Well, I think the most important thing is we have to tell them that we have to do the hard work of explaining to people that science is a work in progress. Mm-hmm. It's done over time by large groups of diverse people who bring lots of different things to it. It's not done by lone geniuses who get hit in the head with an apple,
right?
Who are old white guys like me with facial hair. It's done by teams all over the world who work collaboratively. And whenever we tell you something about science, we're just telling you what we know right now. We're not telling you the final answer.
Right.
We never have it. But we're partly guilty of that because we like to go on TV and say, oh yeah, here's the answer to this. But we always forget to go, oh yeah, but in 2 weeks I might have to tell you it's different.
Right.
And to us, that's what makes science exciting. So if we could communicate it, maybe other people see it exciting in the same way we do. But as long as we keep telling people that, oh, here's this textbook, go read it, this is science, then we're going to be stuck with this problem.
Gotcha.
Okay,
Thank
quickly, let's go over here.
How do you think about questionable research practices and the problem associated with questionable research practices across disciplines, especially with different disciplines having different norms and those norms changing over time?
Question for me, or?
Primarily, well, it was initially for Holden, but
yeah, okay. Well,
Yeah.
I think the important thing there is, you know, because science and science advances go all the way from sociology to quantum computing.
Yeah.
The most important thing is to recognize that the norms in all those disciplines are different. And so what you can't do is you can't have quantum computing saying this is how you judge a sociology paper. Because those things are different. And we need to respect that breadth because that's part of what makes academic life so great.
Okay.
The dean probably has something to add to that, I don't know. Yeah.
Hi, thanks. I'm Steve Goodman. I direct SPORE, and thank you for the shout out, Ruth. So I want to tie a few comments here together and also mention one innovation we have in the School of Medicine. So Mildred, you asked right at the start, what is scientific integrity and how do we create a culture? I think the answer was also offered by the panel, which is that the search for truth is the #1 principle. And Holden hit it on the nose when he said we've outsourced our assessment to the journals because the journals have competing priorities. They also want to be read. They want to be flashy. They have the values of journalism. Of course, they want to be true too. So what they choose to publish shouldn't necessarily shouldn't be the values, exclusive values that we use to promote. So I'll tell a story that just came from a course that I just taught last week, where I was on rigor and reproducibility, and a young scientist said that her idea had been taken by somebody else. They published an experiment using much less rigorous techniques than she wanted to use, and they scooped her with what she considered would be a paper beneath what she would ever want to publish. And she was very distressed. Her paper won't come out for another year. And how do you value that? That you can understand why the journal would publish that first paper, but as academics, we should value the second paper more. And if we can't cut the umbilical cord between the journal acceptances and our own assessment of the quality of the research, we're going to be stuck. And so one thing we've done here with Ruth's approval and help is develop a new CV for the School of Medicine, which helps highlight all of these other things to make them visible. That's the beginning of creating a new research culture, because right now they're not so visible. You just have a bibliography and they can count Nature, Science, Cell. That's what they're counting. But if you're also counting all the things that are on the CV that allow you to see the quality of the science that is being done, regardless of where that science is published, and regardless of whether it's a negative or positive result, then we have the beginning of a translation and the creation of a culture where the academics are valuing the search for truth, even if it takes longer, even if it's published in a less prestigious journal. You know, can we get all our colleagues to value that in the A&P committees and the referees as well? Well, this is part of the transformation, I think, that is happening in science right now with the help of sessions like this. But I do think it's happening, but we have to condition ourselves to not just depend on the bibliometrics, and that's on us. That really is on us. It's really a statement, not a question, but any respect.
All right, well, I am so
very well
sorry. I think
said.
I'll have to start wrapping this up, but I will give each of the panelists a very brief amount of time to make any final statements you want to make.
Oh, well, don't cheat, I guess.
Yes. Good. Yeah, well, I just want to thank everybody for being part of this messy, complicated, highly flawed human endeavor that has every flaw that every other human endeavor has. And being willing to do it when the leaders haven't really figured out how to tell the world what everybody's doing. And that has to be frustrating. So thank you all for what you're doing to contribute to the growth of knowledge in the world.
And I want to thank Holden and Elisabeth for coming to visit with us here at Stanford and provide their insights. I do hope that journals will stay around for a while, despite my efforts with Steve, because I think it's as partners, exactly as Elisabeth has articulated, that and stakeholders, if we can come together, it's actually a wonderful moment in time to try and really tackle and sort of grasp the thorny nettles here.
All right.
Science is about truth, and it's so hard to get truth without trust. Thank you all for this conversation about how we can help build trust together, and for their thoughtful and courageous leadership in these areas. Please let's thank our panelists.